The old Yule traditions of Scotland. The night is cold here in the Highlands. Beyond these walls, frost creeps across the hillsides, turning everything silver in the moonlight. The lochs lie still, their surfaces beginning to freeze at the edges. Snow dusts the peaks of distant mountains, and the air carries that particular silence that comes only in deep winter. Inside, the peat fire burns steady in the hearth. The flames cast dancing shadows on stone walls. The smell of burning rowan mingles with the warmth of the hearth. And in this circle of firelight, we are safe from the darkness, pressing close beyond the door. Tonight, we gather to explore the old Yule traditions of Scotland. Not the Christmas you might know from more recent centuries, but Yule itself, ancient, elemental, rooted in the turning of the stars and the longest night of the year. This is a journey into solstice darkness, into stone circles older than memory, into hearth fires tended through the deepest cold, and into customs that helped our ancestors survive the winter and welcome back the light. Let us begin at the beginning with the sky itself. There is a moment each year when the sun reaches its lowest point in the sky, the shortest day, the longest night. In the northern lands, this moment carries profound weight. For people living close to the edge of survival, the return of the sun was not merely symbolic, it was essential. The winter solstice falls around the 21st of December. On this day, the sun rises late and sets early, tracing a low arc across the southern horizon, before disappearing again into darkness. For those living in the Scottish Highlands and Islands, winter daylight at the solstice lasts barely 7 hours. The rest is night. Imagine what this meant to ancient peoples. No electric lights, no certainty that spring would come, no scientific understanding of planetary motion, only the knowledge, passed down through generations, that the sun had stopped retreating, that from this night forward, each day would grow a little longer, that light would return. The solstice was a threshold, a moment of death and rebirth, the old sun dying, the new sun being born. In the belly of winter's darkness, hope gestated. This was not a cheerful holiday in the modern sense. It was deeper than that, an acknowledgement of mortality and a celebration of renewal, both inseparable from one another. Ancient peoples mark this turning with a fire. Bonfires blazed on hilltops, their flames reaching toward the sky, as if to strengthen the failing sun. Torches were lit and carried through the darkness. The hearth fire, already sacred, became even more so during these longest nights. A sun brought down to earth, a promise that warmth and light would endure. And they watched the sky, They tracked the sun's movements with remarkable precision. They knew when the turning would come, and they built monuments to mark it. Long before Christianity reached Scotland, the people here observed the solstice. But who were these people, and how did they mark this sacred time? The earliest inhabitants, whose monuments we can still see, were the Neolithic peoples, the builders of stone circles and chambered cairns. These people lived here 5,000 years ago or more. They left no written language, but their stones speak clearly enough. They watched the heavens, and they built with purpose. Later came the Picts, those mysterious peoples who carved strange symbols into standing stones, and whose language has been lost to time. The Romans called them Picti, the painted ones, and knew them as fierce warriors who held the north. The Picts left their mark on the land in hill forts and symbol stones. What ceremonies they performed at the solstice, if any, remains unknown, though they lived in a landscape already marked by ancient solar alignments, suggesting the season held meaning for those who came before them. Then came the Gaels, speakers of what would become Scottish Gaelic, bringing with them customs and beliefs from Ireland. They called the winter season by various names, and though much of their lore was oral and therefore lost, fragments survived in prayers, blessings, and folk customs collected centuries later. And finally, from the 8th century onward, came the Norse. They settled particularly in Orkney, Shetland, Caithness, and the Hebrides, bringing with them their own midwinter festival, Yule. This Old Norse word, meaning wheel or cycle, gave us the word Yule we use today. For the Norse, Yule was a time of feasting, sacrifice to the gods, and acknowledgement of the year's turning. It lasted for many days, some sources say 12, and was marked by drinking ale, eating preserved meats, and making oaths that would be binding for the year ahead. These different peoples, Neolithic, Pictish, Gaelic, Norse, all lived in the same land at different times, and their customs blended and blurred together. What we call Scottish Yule is therefore a composite, a patchwork of traditions from many sources, all responding to the same fundamental reality. Winter is long, winter is dark, and the return of the sun is a matter of life and death. In the Highlands, where Gaelic culture remained strongest, the customs were more connected to hearth and home, the livestock and land spirits. In Orkney and Shetland, where Norse influence ran deepest, Yule festivities were longer and more raucous, with feasting that could stretch from mid-December well into January. In the lowlands, these older customs mingled with later influences, creating regional variations that persisted despite attempts to suppress them. But certain themes remained constant across all regions: fire, light and darkness, evergreen plants that stayed alive when all else died, protective rituals to guard against spirits that walked more freely during the long nights. Divination to glimpse the future of the coming year, and gatherings because winter is survived together, not alone. The word Yule itself may have meant wheel, the greatest wheel of the year, turning at its slowest point before beginning to roll forward once more. And whether you were Pict or Gael or Norse, you would have felt it, that pause, that held breath before the light returns. At the centre of every Scottish home stood the hearth. In winter, the hearth was everything: warmth, light, a place to cook, a gathering point for the family. The fire was kept burning continuously if possible, for to let it go out completely was both practically difficult and spiritually dangerous. But at Yule, the hearth fire took on even deeper significance. This was when the Yule log was chosen, prepared and lit. The Yule log in Scotland came by various names depending on the region. In some places it was simply the Yule log. In others, particularly in areas with strong Norse influence, it might be called the Yule clog or Yule backstick. And in some Gaelic-speaking areas, it carried a more haunting name, the Cailleach Nollaig, the old woman of Christmas, the hag of winter. The choosing of the log was important. It had to be large enough to burn through the entire longest night, and ideally for all 12 days of Yule, if the household could manage it. Oak was favoured for its long, steady burn, and its ancient associations with strength and endurance. Birch was used in the far north, where it grew more readily and was valued for its purifying qualities. Rowan, the sacred tree of protection, might be chosen for its ability to ward off harmful spirits and witchcraft. Once selected, the log was brought into the house with ceremony. In some traditions, it was decorated with evergreen branches, holly, ivy, juniper, before being placed in the hearth. Prayers or charms were spoken over it. A piece of the previous year's Yule log, carefully saved, was used to light the new one, creating an unbroken chain of fire stretching back through the years. In certain areas, particularly where older customs persisted, a figure of an old woman might be chalked onto the log's surface. This practice, documented in Scottish folklore collections, appears to have been more common in some regions than others. The figure represented the Cailleach, the Winter Hag, embodiment of the cold season. As the fire burned, her outline would slowly disappear, her image consumed by flames. This burning away of the old woman was said to banish the worst of winter's power, to ensure that spring would eventually come. Some scholars have suggested this practice may have been a symbolic substitute for much older ritual practices, though the true origins remain a matter of interpretation. The Yule log burned through the longest night. Someone in the household stayed awake to tend to it. to make sure it never went out, to watch for omens in the flames. If the fire burned clear and bright, the year ahead would be prosperous. If it sparked and crackled abundantly, that meant good luck, celebrations to come. But if the log burned poorly, if the flames sputtered and the smoke blew back into the room, these were ill omens. The ashes from the Yule log were not simply discarded. They were sacred, imbued with the power of this most important fire. Farmers scattered them on their fields to ensure fertility in the coming growing season. Some kept a portion of the ashes in the house as protection against lightning and misfortune. The charred remains of the log itself might be preserved under the bed to ward off evil spirits, or kept as kindling for next year's fire. And the food prepared during Yule was traditionally cooked over the heat of this special fire. The Yule bannock, the seasonal meats, everything was blessed by being prepared in the warmth of the Cailleach Nollaig as she slowly burned away. In the dead of winter, when the land lies dormant and most plants have died back or dropped their leaves, a few remain green. These plants, holly, ivy, juniper, mistletoe, took on profound symbolic importance. They were proof that life persisted even in death season. They were emblems of hope, of continuation, of the promise that spring would return. Holly, with its glossy dark leaves and bright red berries, was seen as carrying masculine energy. Its sharp, spiky leaves were protective, like a warrior's armour. Holly was hung above doors and windows to guard the threshold against evil spirits. Its red berries, appearing when almost no other colour remained in the landscape, were like drops of life blood, symbols of vitality enduring through hardship. Holly's association with winter protection may connect to older folk beliefs about the struggle between light and darkness through the seasons. In later folklore traditions, some have seen holly as representing winter's power, enduring through the coldest months, but eventually yielding to spring's return. Whatever symbolic meanings people attach to it, holly's presence in the home during Yule offered both practical decoration and a sense of living protection against the season's harshness. Ivy was holly's counterpart, representing feminine energy. Where holly stood upright and defensive, ivy clung and climbed and bound things together. It was associated with fidelity, with the binding of relationships, with things that endure through adversity. In some households, holly and ivy were brought in together and hung as pairs, a balance of masculine and feminine, protection and connection. But there were also those who viewed ivy with suspicion. Because it grew in graveyards and clung to ruins, it carried associations with death and the other world. Some preferred to keep it outside, letting it protect the home from without, rather than welcoming it within. Juniper was perhaps the most sacred plant of all in Scottish tradition. Its aromatic branches were used in the practice of seining, the ritual purification and blessing of a home and livestock. At Yule, juniper would be cut and dried, then set alight so that its thick, pungent smoke could be carried through every room of the house and through the cattle byre. This smoke drove out negative influences that had accumulated over the year and created a protective barrier against spirits that might enter during the vulnerable time of the solstice. The smoke from juniper was so thick it made people cough and eyes water. This was intentional. The intensity of the experience marked it as powerful medicine, a deep cleansing. When the smoke was complete, doors and windows would be flung open to let in fresh air and let out the old energies. The house was purified, ready for the new year. Mistletoe held a special place in ancient tradition because it grew not from the ground, but from the branches of a tree, particularly oak trees. It was seen as a plant of the between places, belonging neither wholly to earth nor wholly to sky. Druids, those pre-Christian priests of the Celtic peoples, revered mistletoe and cut it with special ceremony at the solstice. It was called the all-heal and was thought to bring fertility and protect against illness and evil. In Scotland, mistletoe was rare because the oaks in which it preferred to grow were themselves less common than in milder regions. Where it was found, it was treasured. Sprigs were hung in doorways and over beds. The custom of kissing beneath the mistletoe has very old roots, connected to mistletoe's association with fertility and life force. These evergreens were more than mere decoration. They were living symbols, reminders that even in the darkest time, life endured. They were magic brought into the home, protective, purifying, blessing. To gather them was to gather the strength of the natural world and bring it to bear against winter's harshness. Food at Yule was both practical necessity and sacred offering. The harvest was long over, and stores had to last through the months yet to come. But Yule was a time to feast regardless, to celebrate survival, to share what you had with family and community. The Yule bannock was central to these observances. A bannock is a type of flatbread, traditionally made with oats or barley, the grains that grew well in Scotland's climate. The Yule bannock was special, though larger than everyday bannocks, often enriched with butter or cream, if available, marked with symbols and baked with prayers. The preparation of the Yule bannock was timed carefully. In some regions, it had to be made between noon and 6 o'clock on a particular day. In others, it was prepared on Yule's Eve and baked over the heat of the Cailleach Nollaig, the Yule log burned in the hearth. The edges of the bannock were often indented or pinched to represent the rays of the sun, a reminder of what they were celebrating, the sun's rebirth. Each member of the household would take a turn rotating the bannock as it cooked. turning it sunwise, clockwise, to ensure good fortune. To turn it against the sun was unlucky. Everyone participated in this small ritual, binding the family together in the act of preparing sacred food. Hidden within the bannock might be small trinkets or charms, a bean, a coin, a small stone. These were for divination. When the bannock was broken and shared, whoever found the token could divine something about their fortune in the coming year. The bean might mean abundance, the coin prosperity, the stone a journey. This tradition was an ancestor to later customs, like hiding a silver sixpence in Christmas pudding or charms in a clootie dumpling. But there was also a darker side to bannock divination. If the bannock cracked or broke during baking, before it was ready, this was a terrible omen. It meant death or great misfortune for the household. The watching, the careful tending of the bannock as it cooked was therefore filled with tension as well as hope. Bannocks were also shared with livestock. A piece of the Yule bannock might be given to the cattle, to the horses, to ensure their health through the winter. This was both practical, the animals were crucial to survival, and spiritual, a recognition that all living things were connected, all part of the same cycle of life and death and renewal. Other foods featured in the Yule feast: preserved meats, saved from the autumn slaughtering, oat cakes and barley bread, crowdie, a simple fresh cheese, sowens, a sort of fermented oat porridge, ale brewed specially for the season, and in wealthier households, or on special occasions, perhaps a piece of beef or mutton, a luxury in the depths of winter. The feast was not only for the living. In many traditions, an extra place was set at the table, an offering for ancestors or for travelling spirits who might seek hospitality on this night of all nights. Crumbs might be left outside for the good neighbours, the fairy folk, to keep them content and prevent mischief. A small portion of ale poured onto the ground as libation. To eat together at Yule was to affirm community, to declare that winter would not divide us, that we would share what we had and survive together until spring. Yule was not a single day, but a season. Traditionally, it stretched from the solstice through the first days of January. 12 days, 12 nights, a liminal period where the old year died and the new year struggled to be born. This was a time out of time. The sun's movement seemed to pause at its lowest point. The word solstice itself comes from the Latin words meaning sun standing still. The usual rules did not fully apply. The boundary between the world of the living and the world of the dead grew thin. Spirits walked, magic was stronger, divination was more potent. During these 12 days, certain work was forbidden. No spinning, for to spin would be to tangle the fates, to weave misfortune into the coming year. No washing of clothes, for to wash might be to wash away a member of the family. No lending of fire or salt, or any essential thing, for what left the house during Yule might not return, taking the household's luck with it. Instead, these were days of rest, storytelling, games, and observance. The hard labour of farming was suspended anyway by the frozen ground and short days. People stayed close to home, close to the hearth, and took this time to mend tools, repair clothes, and strengthen community bonds. Each day had its own character, its own observances. The first day, the solstice itself, was for watching the sun's return, for lighting the Yule log, for beginning the celebrations. Subsequent days might be for blessing the livestock, for divination, for visiting neighbours, for special meals. The 12th day, often falling near the beginning of January, was the culmination. In some places, this was called 12th night, and it was when the Yule season officially ended. It was a night for one final feast, one final round of divination, one final blessing before returning to ordinary time. These were sometimes called the daft days, days of foolishness, of relaxation, of breaking from the usual stern discipline of life. But they were also days of heightened spiritual awareness, of protection rituals renewed nightly, of careful attention to omens and signs. The 12 days of Yule were a gift, a pause in the endless work of survival, a space to breathe and remember why survival mattered. They were a recognition that humans are not merely workers, but souls, needing beauty and story and rest and connection. The longest night is when the veil grows thinnest. Darkness stretches long, and in that darkness, other things move. The old people knew this. They knew that Yule was a dangerous time as well as a sacred one. The same threshold that allowed the sun to be reborn also allowed other things to cross over. Spirits, ancestors, creatures from the other world. Not all of them were friendly. Household spirits had to be honoured. These were the wights that lived in the home and the land, the unseen presences that could bring good fortune or ill, depending on how they were treated. During Yule, offerings were left out for them. Bannocks, milk, ale. The house had to be kept clean and tidy, for household spirits disliked disorder and would cause trouble if they found filth or neglect. In Orkney and Shetland, where Norse traditions ran strong, people spoke of trows, creatures similar to trolls or underground folk. During the Yules, as the season was called there, the trows were given permission to leave their mounds and walk the land. Precautions had to be taken, doors marked with crosses made of straw, cattle blessed and protected with plaited hair charms hung over the byre. Children kept close and warned not to wander after dark. The good neighbours, that careful euphemism for the fairy folk, were particularly active at Yule. They might steal away a child if given the chance, leaving a changeling in its place. They might ride horses through the night, and any horse not properly protected would be found exhausted and lathered in the morning. They might enter the house if proper protections were not in place, dancing and feasting and leaving chaos in their wake. Iron was an essential defence. Horseshoes nailed above the door. Knives were placed on windowsills. Iron was anathema to fairy folk and kept them at bay. Rowan branches, too, were hung at every threshold, and salt scattered, salt blessed with prayers, salt that purified and protected. And then there was the Cailleach, the Winter Hag herself. She deserves special mention, for she rules this season entirely. The Cailleach is one of the most powerful figures in Scottish Gaelic folklore. She is ancient beyond reckoning, a goddess or land spirit who predates even the old gods. From Samhain to Beltane, from autumn to spring, the land belongs to her. At the winter solstice, the Cailleach's power reaches its peak. She is winter incarnate, the frost, the snow, the bitter wind. She strikes the ground with her staff, and it freezes hard as iron. She herds her deer across the mountains, bringing storms in her wake. In one piece of weather folklore, if the weather is clear on the solstice, she is gathering firewood for a long winter ahead. If the weather is foul, she rests indoors, suggesting winter's harshest days have already passed. She is not evil, the Cailleach. She is a force of nature, as necessary as summer's warmth. Without her, there would be no rest for the land, no renewal. But she is stern, and she is powerful, and at Yule, offerings might be left for her. Milk poured on the ground, bannock crumbled at the doorstep, in hopes that she would be kind, that her season would not be too harsh, that she would allow her grip to loosen as the light returned. After the solstice, imperceptibly at first, her power begins to wane. The days lengthen, the sun climbs higher, the Cailleach's time is passing. By Imbolc, in early February, she will be overcome, and Breed, the goddess of spring, will take her place. But that is still many weeks away. For now, in the depths of Yule, the Cailleach reigns. Spirits of the dead also walked at Yule. The boundary between worlds was thin, and ancestors might return to visit their descendants. Some families set an extra place at the table for this reason, welcoming the presence of those who had gone before. Others were less sanguine about the dead walking and made sure their protections were strong. And there was the Slua, the host of the unforgiven dead, the restless souls who had died badly and could not find peace. They flew on the wind, particularly the west wind, seeking to steal away the souls of the dying. Windows facing west were kept tightly shut and shuttered during Yule nights. Prayers were spoken. Iron and rowan stood guard. The darkness held many things, some harmful, some helpful, some merely strange. The key was respect, caution, and proper observance. Keep the fire burning, Keep the protections in place, honour what must be honoured, and survive until dawn. Long before the Gaels, long before the Norse, long before even the Picts, there were people here, people who watched the sky with remarkable care, who understood the movements of the sun and moon, and who built monuments that still stand after 5,000 years. On the Isle of Lewis in the Outer Hebrides, rising from the moorland like the fingers of some ancient giant, stand the Callanish stones. They are older than the pyramids of Egypt, older than Stonehenge, though less famous than either. The main site consists of a circle of 13 tall stones with a monolith at the centre, nearly 5 metres high. From this circle, stone rows extend outward in a rough cross shape, with the longest avenue stretching north for nearly 80 metres. The stones are made of Lewisian gneiss, some of the oldest rock on earth, formed billions of years ago in processes we can barely imagine. They were quarried locally and raised with immense effort by Neolithic peoples we know almost nothing about. We do not know what they called themselves. We do not know their language, but we know they watched the heavens because the stones prove it. Callanish is aligned to the movements of both sun and moon. Every 18.6 years, the moon reaches what's called the major lunar standstill, when it rises and sets at its most extreme positions on the horizon. At Callanish, during the standstill, the moon appears to skim low over a range of hills that locals call the Sleeping Beauty, or in Gaelic, Cailleach Winter Hag, the Old Woman of the Moors. This remarkable sight suggests that builders were tracking the complex cycles of the moon with great precision. The stones also align with solar events. The main stone formation is oriented towards the midsummer sunset and the midwinter sunrise. When the sun rises on the shortest day of the year, its light strikes through the avenue of stones, marking the moment of solstice with intention and care. Imagine standing at Callanish on the longest night. The stars wheel overhead in the clear northern sky. You and your community have gathered, as your ancestors gathered for generations uncounted. You wait in the cold and the dark, and then, finally in the east light, the sun returns. It rises, pale and weak, but rising nonetheless. The light strikes the stones, and you know winter has returned. The days will begin to lengthen. Life will return. In Orkney, on mainland, there is a chambered cairn called Maeshowe. It is a tomb built around 2800 BCE, with a passage leading into a central chamber. The tomb is aligned with mathematical precision to the winter solstice sunset. For a few days on either side of the solstice, as the sun sets in the southwest, its last rays shine directly down the passage, a passage more than 11 metres long, and illuminate the back wall of the chamber. The light penetrates the tomb, reaches into the darkness, touches stone that otherwise knows only night. This is not accident. The builders of Maeshowe carefully calculated the angle, the orientation, the height. They created a marriage of architecture and astronomy, a moment when the dying light of the dying year enters the house of the dead. It is both beautiful and haunting. The meaning they attached to this moment has been lost to time. Perhaps the light carried some blessing to the dead. Perhaps it marked the turning point of the year in a ritual we can no longer fully understand. We can only witness what they built and feel the power of that moment when light touches darkness. Standing inside Maeshowe as the solstice light enters is an experience that defies easy description. The passage is low. You must stoop to enter. The chamber is cool and dark, the weight of earth and stone pressing close above. And then the light comes, a blade of gold cutting through the darkness, illuminating motes of dust, reaching toward the back wall. For a few minutes, the tomb is transformed. The dead are touched by the light, and then it fades, and darkness returns. These sites, Callanish, Maeshowe, and others like Clavacairns, Ballochroy, the Ring of Brodgar, tell us that the winter solstice mattered to the ancient peoples of Scotland. It mattered so much that they invested enormous labour in making it. They quarried stones, hauled them across miles of rough terrain, raised them into place with only human muscle and simple tools. They dug and built chambers underground, calculated angles with uncanny precision, created calendars in stone. They understood what we sometimes forget, that we live on a planet orbiting a star, that the rhythm of the seasons is a celestial dance, and that understanding this dance is sacred knowledge. The solstice was not merely a date to them. It was a hinge point of existence, a moment when the wheel of the year turned and everything changed. And so they built monuments that would allow their descendants, thousands of years later, to witness the same moment they witnessed, to feel the same awe, to remember that we are small and the cosmos is vast, and the light always, always returns. At Yule, when the veil between worlds was thin, and the future was not yet written, divination was practiced widely. People wanted to know what the coming year would bring. Would they marry? Would the crops thrive? Would they survive to see another winter? One method, documented across various parts of Europe, and likely practiced in Scotland as well, was molten lead divination. A small piece of lead would be melted in a ladle over the fire. When fully liquid, it would be quickly poured into a bowl of cold water. The lead would solidify instantly into strange shapes, and these shapes would be interpreted for meaning. A ring shape might mean marriage, a ship, a journey across water, an animal, livestock fortune. good or ill, depending on the form. A cross might mean death or great trial. The diviner, often an older woman, skilled in such things, would turn the solidified lead this way and that, reading shadows and edges, seeing in the random forms the patterns of fate. Similar divination could be done with wax dripped into water, or by casting stones or sticks into the fire and watching how they burned. Anything that produced random patterns could potentially reveal hidden knowledge. Dreams on the solstice night were thought to be prophetic. To encourage such dreams, a person might sleep with certain herbs under their pillow, mugwort for visions, yarrow for truth, or a piece of Yule bannock to connect them to the sacred season. What they dreamed would give them insight into the year ahead. Unmarried young people were particularly interested in divination about their romantic futures. Would they marry soon? Who would be their spouse? Various folk practices attempted to answer these questions. Apple peel divination was one such practice. An apple would be peeled in one long, continuous strip, and then the peel would be tossed over the shoulder. The shape it formed on the ground was supposed to resemble the initial of one's future spouse. Nut burning was another tradition. 2 nuts would be named for 2 lovers and placed side by side on the fire. If they burnt peacefully together, the relationship would endure. If they popped and jumped apart, it meant discord and separation. First footing, though more commonly associated with Hogmanay and New Year, had roots in older Yule customs. The first person to enter the house after the solstice, or after midnight on a particular night, would bring either good fortune or ill for the year ahead. Ideally, this first footer should be dark-haired rather than fair, should carry symbolic gifts, a piece of coal for warmth, bread for food, salt for preservation, a coin for prosperity, and should enter with good wishes and a cheerful demeanour. To turn away a first footer was bad luck. The weather at Yule was also read for omens, following folk beliefs that persisted across Scotland. A clear, cold solstice night was thought to foretell a harsh winter yet to come. A cloudy or stormy solstice might suggest the worst of winter was over. The direction of the wind, the behaviour of bird and animals, the appearance of halos around the moon, all were noted and interpreted according to local tradition. These divination practices were not idle superstition. In a time before weather forecasting, before modern medicine, before insurance and safety nets, people lived with tremendous uncertainty. Divination offered a sense of agency, a way to peer into the darkness of the unknown future and perhaps prepare for what was coming. Even if the predictions were not always accurate, the act of seeking knowledge, of trying to understand, was itself empowering. And sometimes, perhaps, the veil truly was thinner. Sometimes, perhaps, the divinations were right. Winter nights are long, and the dark must be filled with something. In the days before electric light, before television and radio, the long evenings were filled with stories. Yule was an ideal time for storytelling. The household was gathered close, the fire burned bright, and there was little work to be done. So the tales were told, stories of heroes and monsters, of the fairy folk and their strange ways, of ghosts and selkies and ancient magic. Ghost stories were popular. The dead walked at Yule, after all, so it was fitting to tell of them. Stories of warnings from beyond the grave, of spirits who returned to protect or to seek vengeance, of phantom travellers who appeared at the door seeking shelter only to vanish when dawn came. Selkie tales came from the islands and coasts. Selkies were seal folk, creatures who could shed their seal skins and walk on land as humans. The stories often told of Selkie women who married human men, bearing children who had webbed fingers and longed for the sea. But always the Selkie wife would find her hidden skin eventually, and always she would return to the ocean, leaving her family behind. These were tales of longing, of things that cannot be held, of the wild calling to the wild. The fairy folk featured in countless stories. Tales of people stolen away to the fairy realm, of changelings left in place of human babies, of musicians lured to play for fairy revels who returned to find 100 years had passed. These were cautionary tales, teaching people to be wary, to avoid certain places at certain times, to protect their children and themselves from the good neighbours. Hero tales were also told, stories of Finn MacCool and the Fianna, those legendary warriors of old Ireland whose tales had spread to Scotland, stories of Cú Chulainn and his great deeds, and local legends too, particularly to each glen and loch and hill, the giant who built this stone circle, the witch who cursed that family, the ghost that haunts this stretch of road. Ballads were sung as well as stories told, ballads of love and loss, of tragedy and triumph. The ballad tradition in Scotland is rich and old, with songs passed down through generations, changing slightly with each telling, accumulating regional variations. Some ballads were specifically for the season, songs about the return of the sun, about winter's hardships, about gatherings and celebrations. The music was often melancholy. Scottish traditional music has a particular quality of sweet sorrow, but it was communal, binding people together in shared melody. Why did the veil feel thinner at Yule? Perhaps because darkness itself is liminal, a threshold space. The ancient peoples had no way to banish the night completely. They lived in it, surrounded by it, for half of every day and more in winter, and the darkness held mysteries, sounds you could not identify, shapes you could not quite see. The darkness was where the unknown lived. And at Yule, when darkness reigned longest, when the old year died and the new struggled to be born, when the sun itself seemed to pause and consider whether to return, At this hinge point, this between time, boundaries dissolved. The living and the dead stood closer. The human world and the other world almost touched. And in that closeness, anything might happen. So the stories were told, the ballads sung, the knowledge passed on. This is how you protect yourself. This is what you do if you meet the fairy folk. This is how you survive the winter. This is why we gather. This is why we remember. There is a particular quality to deep winter that we have perhaps forgotten in our modern age of constant noise and light. A quality of stillness, of silence, of the world holding its breath. During Yule, particularly during the 12 days, there was a belief that one should not be too loud, should not create unnecessary disturbance. This was partly practical. Sound carries far in cold, still air, and one did not want to attract unwanted attention from whatever spirits might be listening. But it was also something deeper. This was sacred time, time out of time. The wheel of the year paused at its lowest point. And in that pause, there was something holy in simply being quiet, being still, letting the darkness be what it was, without fighting it or fleeing from it. The prohibitions against certain types of work enforced this quietness. No spinning meant no clacking of the wheel, no rhythmic thumping. No washing meant no beating of cloth, no splashing of water. The usual sounds of industry fell silent. Instead, the household went about gentler tasks, mending tools with slow, careful hands, stitching and patching by firelight, preparing food, but not in the busy rush of harvest season or spring planting. Slow food, bannocks baked with attention, stew that simmered for hours, filling the house with its scent. And much time was spent simply sitting by the fire, watching the flames, letting thoughts drift. This was not considered laziness. It was considered necessary. The land rested, the animals rested. Why should humans not rest as well? The rest was not merely passivity. It was a form of spiritual practice, though they might not have called it that. To sit quietly in winter's darkness, to feel the cold pressing against the walls, to listen to the wind and the crackle of the fire, to let the mind wander through memory and dream. This was a way of connecting with something larger than the daily scramble for survival. Children were taught to be quiet during the Yule days, to move carefully, to speak softly. This was partly to avoid disturbing spirits, but it also created an atmosphere of reverence, of attention. Even the young learned that some moments required stillness. The hearth was tended with special care. The fire must not go out, so someone was always watchful, always ready to add another piece of peat, to shift the logs, to tend the sacred flame. This tending became a kind of meditation, a focus for the mind. Reflection was encouraged. The old year was dying. What had it brought? What had been lost? What had been learned? And what did one hope for the new year? These questions were pondered in silence by firelight, while the wind rattled the shutters and the world outside lay frozen. This was also a time for prayer, not necessarily the formal prayers of the church, though those had their place, but the older prayers, the folk prayers in Gaelic, the prayers that called on Breed and Michael and the old powers alongside Christ and Mary, prayers for protection, for blessing, for the safety of the household and the livestock. Prayers spoken quietly, almost whispered, just another part of the household's breath. The storms might rage outside, the world might be dark and cold and hostile, but inside, in the circle of firelight, there was warmth, there was family, there was the quiet certainty that they would endure. And there was time to simply be, to exist without purpose or striving, to sit with what was, to honour the darkness by not rushing to fill it with noise and busyness. Winter teaches patience. The seed in the ground cannot be hurried. The frozen earth will thaw when it will thaw, and not before. There is wisdom in waiting, in trusting the cycle, in knowing that light returns, not because we force it, but because that is the nature of light. The quiet days of Yule were an acknowledgement of this truth, a space carved out of the year for stillness and reflection, for being rather than doing, for listening rather than speaking, for trust rather than control. The land lies sleeping under snow, the rivers slow, ice forming at their edges. The bare trees stand like sentinels against grey skies. The animals huddle in dens and nests, conserving warmth, conserving life. Everything rests. The rest is not death, though winter and death are close kin. It is gestation, dormancy, the pause before new growth. Beneath the frozen ground, roots sleep and dream. In the bare branches, buds wait, invisible but present, ready to burst forth when warmth returns. Farmers knew this rhythm in their bones. The land must rest to be fertile. Constant growth would exhaust the soil. Winter's rest was necessary, was sacred, and so the farm itself fell into quietness. No ploughing, no planting, no harvest, only maintenance, survival, waiting. But the livestock still needed care. Cattle, sheep, horses. They were brought closer to the house in winter, sheltered in barns and byres as best as possible, and at Yule they received special attention. The practice of seining extended to the animals. Juniper smoke would be carried through the byre, purifying the space where the beasts lived. Each animal might be individually blessed, a hand laid on its head, a prayer spoken for its health and protection. Charms would be hung, round crosses above the door, iron nails at each corner, red thread braided into the manes and tails of horses to prevent the fairies from riding them at night, each braid a small spell of safety. Cattle were particularly important. They provided milk, butter, cheese. They pulled ploughs. They were wealth on 4 legs. To lose cattle to disease or accident in winter could mean disaster for the family. So every protection, every blessing was given. In some traditions, a portion of the Yule bannock was shared with each cow, placed directly in its mouth as an offering and blessing. The cattle were spoken to gently as fellow creatures struggling through the dark season together. Sheep might have their fleeces marked with a protective symbol using red dye or clay. And the Cailleach herself was remembered in relation to the livestock. She was, after all, a shepherd of deer, guardian of wild things. In some tales, she herded the deer through winter, like a farmer herds cattle. To invoke her blessing on one's own animals was to align with natural forces, to ask for her care to extend to the domestic as well as the wild. At the solstice, the Cailleach's power stood at its peak. She was winter in its fullest force. But from this moment forward, her grip would begin, slowly, imperceptibly, to loosen. Each day after the solstice brought a little more light. The sun climbed higher, arc by arc, week by week. The balance was shifting. This shift was not immediate or obvious. In many ways, the worst of winter came after the solstice. January and February could be brutally cold, storms fierce, resources dwindling, but the knowledge that the light was returning, that the days were lengthening, that spring was coming, however far off it seemed, the knowledge sustained hope. The people watched for signs. When would the first birds return from the south? When would the ice on the loch begin to thin? When would the first green shoots appear in sheltered places? These signs were celebrated, noted, discussed. They were proof that the cycle continued, that their faith in the returning light was justified. And they prepared. In the lengthening light of late winter, preparations would begin for spring, tools checked and repaired, seeds sorted and blessed, plans made for planting. The quiet time was ending. Soon the wheel would turn again, carrying them from winter into spring, from the Cailleach's reign into breeds, from darkness into growing light. But that was yet to come, for now, in the depths of Yule, the world still slept, and so the people kept vigil. They tended their fires, blessed their animals, told their stories, and waited. They honoured winter by living through it with dignity and hope. They honoured darkness by keeping light alive in the heart of it, and they honoured the turning of the wheel by marking the moment of its turning with ceremony and celebration and quiet, determined faith. The fire in our hearth has burned low. The peat glows red and soft now, no longer flaming, but holding heat, keeping back the cold. Outside, the night is deep and still. The frost has painted the windows with patterns, like ferns, like feathers. The world sleeps under winter's blanket. We have travelled far tonight. from the astronomy of ancient peoples to stone circles that still stand after 5 millennia, from the Yule log burning through the longest night to evergreens brought inside as promises of life, from bannocks baked with prayers to spirits walking the threshold darkness, from tales told by firelight to the quiet keeping of the hearth, from divination and dreams to the patient waiting for the light's return. Yule, as celebrated in Old Scotland, was not a single thing. It was a patchwork of traditions for many peoples, Neolithic, Pictish, Gaelic, Norse, all responding to the same fundamental reality. Winter is hard, darkness is long, survival requires both practical skill and spiritual sustenance, and the return of the sun is not guaranteed by wishing, but by the great cosmic dance that we are all part of. These traditions, the fire, the stones, the stories, the blessings, were ways of living in harmony with that dance, ways of saying, we see you, winter, we acknowledge your power, but we also keep the light alive. We tend the fire, we tell the stories, we survive together, and we trust that spring will come. Much has been lost, the old languages fade, the customs are forgotten or dismissed as superstition. The stone circles stand lonely on the moors, visited by tourists who do not know what they meant to those who built them. The world has changed beyond recognition from the world our ancestors knew. But something remains. The solstice still comes. The sun still pauses, still turns, still begins its long climb back towards summer. The stones still mark the moment with precision, and some of us still feel it, that sense of the year turning, that relief as light begins to return, that need to mark this hinge point with ceremony and attention. You do not need to believe in the Cailleach or the fairy folk or any particular interpretation to feel the power of the solstice. You need only stand in the darkness and wait for dawn. You need only notice the slow lengthening of days after the turning. You need only tend your own fire, whatever form that fire takes. The hearth was never only about heat. It was about the centre, the gathering place, the heart of home. And whether your hearth is a literal fireplace or something more metaphorical, the table where your family gathers, the work you do that gives your life meaning, the connections that sustain you through hard times, the principle remains: tend the hearth, keep the light alive, survive together. As you drift towards sleep tonight, warmed by the memory of these old traditions, let yourself feel what those ancestors felt, the cold beyond the walls, the darkness that presses close, the small brave flame that holds both back, the community of those who sit with you in the circle of light, and the promise, always the promise, that morning will come, that spring will return, that light endures. The Cailleach's reign is not forever. The stones remember, the cycle turns. Sleep well, dream of stone circles and falling snow, of hearth fires and midwinter stars. And when you wake, notice that the light lingers just a little longer than yesterday. The wheel has turned. We are climbing toward the light. If this journey through Scotland's old Yule traditions brought you warmth and wonder, consider leaving a like or subscribing to join us again by the fireside. Until we meet again, in story and season, may your own hearth burn bright. Good night.